January 1940, a cold wind rolls in from the Channel, sweeping across the lonely crest of St. Boniface down on the Isle of Wight. The hill is silent except for the distant hum of generators and the steady pulse of radar equipment inside a cramped wooden hut perched just below the ridgeline. Frost clings to the guy wires of the tall steel towers outside, turning them into pale, skeletal shapes against the gray morning sky. Inside, a WAAF operator sits alone beneath a dim red lamp, her eyes fixed on the flickering arc of a cathode-ray tube. The room smells of warm cables and cigarette ash. At first, the screen shows only the soft heartbeat of the station's own transmission. Then a faint echo appears at the edge of the display. One blip, then another, then dozens more, gathering like a distant storm. The operator straightens, lifts the black telephone handset, and quietly passes a message up the chain to Fighter Command. There is no drama in her voice, no urgency, only calm precision. And as that lone call leaves the hilltop, it begins a sequence that will ripple across airfields, command rooms, and the skies above Britain, a chain of events shaped by a tiny radar station that few outside the service even knew existed, yet whose signal would help decide the fate of a nation. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood in a position it had not faced for nearly 1,000 years. Isolated, outnumbered, and staring directly into the possibility of invasion. France had fallen with shocking speed. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped across the Channel, leaving most of its vehicles smoldering or abandoned on the beaches around Dunkirk. In London, Winston Churchill spoke of blood, toil, tears, and sweat. But behind the speeches lay a harder truth. The country had lost its greatest military partner, and the German war machine now occupied every coastline from Norway to the Bay of Biscay. The Channel, once a protective moat, suddenly felt narrow and vulnerable. In northern France, the Luftwaffe gathered in force. Airfields filled with Messerschmitt fighters, Dornier and Heinkel bombers, and the crews who had swept aside the air forces of Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's plan for the invasion of Britain, existed only on paper, but its success relied on one central condition: the destruction of the Royal Air Force's ability to fight. Without control of the skies, the Kriegsmarine would not risk sending barges and troop transports across waters dominated by British warships. Thus, before any German soldier could set foot on English soil, the RAF had to be broken. But Fighter Command was in no position to withstand a prolonged beating. Britain entered June 1940 with only a few hundred operational Hurricanes and Spitfires, many flown by exhausted pilots who had not enjoyed a moment of true rest since the fighting in France. Replacement aircraft trickled in from factories working around the clock, yet losses often outpaced production. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts all had to be rationed. Every squadron that scrambled wasted precious resources. Every sortie flown was a calculation, one more flight, one more chance to lose planes the RAF could not easily replace. Geography added another layer of danger. The south coast of England, with its dispersed airfields and sprawling naval bases, lay only minutes of flying time from French airfields. A German raid detected too late would arrive before British fighters could climb to altitude. If the Luftwaffe achieved surprise even a handful of times, the consequences could be catastrophic: burning aircraft on the ground, wrecked hangars, ruptured fuel lines, and shattered control towers. A sudden, well-timed blow might cripple Fighter Command beyond repair. This is why the Isle of Wight became so important. The island sits like a gatehouse at the entrance to the Solent, guarding the approaches to Portsmouth, Southampton, and the vital shipyards where Royal Navy vessels were built and repaired. From its elevated spine of chalk hills, one could see deep into the Channel. A German force attempting to land along the southern coast would almost certainly pass within sight or within detection range of those heights. What Britain needed most was warning. Minutes, even seconds, that would allow its few fighter squadrons to be placed exactly where they were needed rather than dispersed blindly across the sky. But warning could not come from human eyes alone. The Channel's weather changed without notice. Rain squalls and sea mists could swallow entire formations. The Observer Corps, An army of civilians trained to spot aircraft visually provided valuable information but could not see beyond the horizon. To detect an approaching raid before it crossed the coastline required something new, something that seemed almost impossible, a way to sense distant aircraft hidden beyond the curve of the Earth. Behind the scenes, Britain had been quietly constructing the answer, a chain of early warning radar stations stretching from the Scottish east coast all the way down to the Isle of Wight. It was called Chain Home. It relied on steel transmitter towers, arrays of receiving aerials, and huts filled with humming, glowing electronic equipment that only a handful of specialists truly understood. At the time, the system was crude, limited, and imperfect. It could measure bearing and distance but not height. It struggled to detect low-flying aircraft. It required constant maintenance, constant calibration, and constant concentration from those who operated it. Yet it offered something Britain had never possessed before, a glimpse into the future. By sending out radio waves and listening for their echoes, the stations could see what human eyes could not. The faint outline of approaching German formations long before they reached the Channel. Among all these outposts, Vintner on the Isle of Wight held a particularly vulnerable and vital position. As the southernmost station in the entire network, it formed the tip of Britain's electronic shield. Its range extended into the Channel and brushed the coast of France. If Britain were to survive the coming storm, stations like Vintner would have to stand firm, regardless of fatigue, enemy action, or the relentless pressure of operating on the edge of war. From London to the Air Ministry to the smallest coastal town, a simple reality settled in during those dark months. The RAF could not afford to fight blind. The survival of a nation depended on minutes of warning delivered from isolated rooms filled with flickering screens. And as the shadow of invasion deepened, these lonely signals from the coast would become the first line of Britain's defense, the thin technical barrier standing between the Luftwaffe and the skies above southern England. The next step in this story is how this invisible shield was built and how Vintner became one of its most critical points. Long before British pilots clashed with German fighters over the Channel, a different kind of struggle had taken place in laboratories, workshops, and remote coastal fields. The idea that radio waves could detect distant aircraft seemed improbable in the early 1930s, yet the fear of a devastating air attack drove British scientists to explore every possibility. The Air Ministry had speculated about death rays capable of destroying enemy bombers at long range. But when physicist Robert Watson-Watt was asked to evaluate the concept, he offered something far more practical. He demonstrated that radio waves could not destroy aircraft, but they could reveal their presence. From this small insight arose a technological revolution that would shape the very foundation of Britain's air defense. Experiments conducted at RAF Bawdsey Manor on the Suffolk coast quickly proved that high-frequency radio transmissions could reflect off aircraft, producing measurable signals. The method was primitive at first, relying on bulky transmitters, experimental receivers, and hand-drawn plots. Yet despite its limitations, the system worked. By 1937, tests showed that approaching aircraft could be detected at remarkable distances, giving Britain a tool no other nation possessed. What remained was to turn this experimental technology into a nationwide chain of linked warning posts, a project that required urgency, secrecy, and an enormous effort from engineers and construction crews. What emerged was the Chain Home Network, a string of tall radar stations stretching across Britain's eastern and southern coasts. Each site consisted of massive steel towers up to 350 feet high, paired with arrays of timber receiver masts that bristled with wires and antennas. Beneath them, in clusters of huts and bunkers, operators monitored cathode-ray screens, filtering out static, ground echoes, and atmospheric noise to identify aircraft moving far beyond human sight. The system was not sleek or elegant. It was an industrial wall of metal, cables, and humming machinery, but it had the power to turn minutes into a weapon. The Isle of Wight played a unique role in this structure. Vintner, perched atop St. Boniface Down, was chosen not for convenience, but for geography. The Down is the highest point on the island and one of the most commanding vantage points along the southern coast. From this exposed ridge, the radar beams could sweep deep into the channel and detect formations rising from airfields around Cherbourg and the Cotentin Peninsula. Construction of the Vintner Station began in the late 1930s and continued with intense urgency as the threat of war grew. By the time hostilities broke out in September 1939, Vintner was one of Britain's first fully operational chain home sites. Life on the hilltop moved to a war rhythm almost immediately. The towers, visible for miles, were quickly camouflaged or painted in muted tones to blend with the landscape. Barbed wire fences encircled the perimeter. Armed guards patrolled the narrow access roads that wound up from the towns below. Inside the scattered huts, the equipment hummed day and night. The operators, many of them young women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, learned to read the strange electronic signatures that flickered across their screens. A faint spike at long range might signal a reconnaissance aircraft. A cluster of stronger echoes meant a bomber formation. Every trace, every blip, every rise and fall in the electronic noise carried meaning. The structure of Britain's air defense depended on more than just raw detection. The information gathered at Vintner, like all chain home stations, had to be passed swiftly and accurately into the Dowding System, a groundbreaking command network named after Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. This system linked radar stations, the Observer Corps, and RAF sector stations into a single operational picture. When Vintner detected an incoming raid, the plot was phoned to the filter room at Fighter Command Headquarters. There, skilled teams cross-checked reports from multiple stations, corrected errors, and produced a unified track of enemy movement. That information then flowed to sector stations that directed fighter squadrons with remarkable efficiency. In this sense, Vintner was not just a radar site. It was one cell in a vast nervous system, sending signals into a body that needed to react instantly. If any part of the system faltered, if a station went down, if a line was cut, if a plot was delayed, the whole defensive structure risked collapsing. Dowding's strategy relied entirely on timely information. Without the early warning provided by stations like Vintner, the RAF would be forced to keep fighters constantly airborne and standing patrols, burning precious fuel and wearing out engines. With radar, they could wait on the ground until the moment of need, conserving strength for decisive interceptions. Yet the chain had weaknesses. Chain homes struggled to detect low-flying aircraft, leaving a dangerous blind spot that enemy fighters could exploit. Atmospheric conditions could distort signals. Equipment broke down, and the stations themselves were exposed. Tall towers rising from cliff edges and downs were impossible to hide from German reconnaissance aircraft. Luftwaffe analysts quickly noted their locations and marked them as suspicious installations. Even before the Battle of Britain began, German commanders understood that these masts were more than just radio facilities. They were part of a system that allowed Britain to respond with uncanny precision. Despite these vulnerabilities, chain home remained an extraordinary achievement. It represented a fusion of science, engineering, and operational innovation that no other nation had matched. At Vintner, the combination of height, equipment, and trained operators produced one of the southern coast's most valuable radar outposts. Day after day, night after night, the station fed information into the growing machinery of Britain's national defense. As pressure mounted through the summer of 1940, Vintner's green arcs swept tirelessly across the sky, searching for any sign of the storm they knew must come. And when that storm finally formed over the airfields of northern France, it would strike directly at the fragile heart of the system, the men and women, the towers and wires, and the lonely stations like Vintner that stood between invasion and survival. Life at the Vintner radar station was unlike life anywhere else in Britain during those tense months of 1940. The site, perched on the bare crest of St. Boniface Down, felt cut off from the world below. The nearest towns, Vintner, Wroxall, and Shanklin, seemed distant despite being only minutes away by road. Up on the Down, the wind was constant, the air sharper, the temperature lower. Fog rolled in unpredictably from the channel, blanketing the towers and leaving the operators to work in a silent, ghostly landscape. It was an isolated world, but the people who lived and worked there understood that their isolation carried great responsibility. Many of the station's operators were women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. They were young, some barely 19 years old, yet they carried the burden of interpreting signals that could decide the outcome of entire battles. Their working environment was far from glamorous. The interiors of the wooden huts were cramped, drafty, and filled with equipment that emitted a constant hum. The glow of cathode-ray screens cast pale light across tired faces during long night shifts. Cigarette smoke mixed with the smell of heated electronics. The operators wore headsets that delivered rapid, clipped instructions and reports, creating a soundscape of urgency even during quiet hours. The work itself demanded intense concentration. Radar screens did not present clear pictures. They displayed shifting lines, faint blips, and fleeting patterns that required trained eyes to interpret correctly. A momentary lapse, a misread, echo, or a delayed report could lead to squadrons being sent to the wrong height or wrong location. Pilots might climb into empty air while enemy bombers slipped through the gaps. The operators knew this. Every shift brought a quiet weight, the knowledge that a simple oversight could cost lives in the skies above the channel. The emotional rhythm of the station oscillated between monotony and sudden urgency. Hours could pass with nothing on the screens but atmospheric clutter. The operators would sit in near silence, exchanging only brief words with mechanics or clerks. Then, without warning, a new echo would appear. 2 blips. 10. A cluster spreading across the scope like a shadow. The quiet was shattered by the rapid relay of information. Multiple returns. Bearing south-southeast. Range increasing. Telephones rang. Plotters in the filter room miles away marked wax-covered tables with grease pencils. Fighter Command began its silent calculations. And throughout all of it, the operators kept watching, making sense of the shifting green traces as their heartbeats quickened. Life outside the huts provided no real escape from the tension. The site was ringed by barbed wire, defended by small detachments of RAF guards who walked their rounds with rifles slung over their shoulders. Off-duty personnel slept in simple barracks exposed to the constant wind. Letters from home offered fleeting comfort, but also reminders of the wider war. Brothers in the army, fathers evacuated from Dunkirk, friends serving on ships, now patrolling the Atlantic. Everyone on the hill carried some private worry. Yet personal fears could never interfere with the demands of the station. Despite the pressure, a sense of camaraderie grew among the staff. Shared routines, shared dangers, and the shared understanding of their mission created bonds that could not be formed anywhere else. Mechanics joked grimly about equipment failures. Operators teased each other during brief lulls, trying to keep morale intact. On rare, clear days, some would stand outside and look southward across the glittering channel, knowing that the next raid could already be forming somewhere beyond that horizon. In these quiet moments, the landscape itself became a reminder of why they were there. At night, when the huts glowed softly against the darkness and the towers stood like silent guardians, the isolation felt even deeper. The hum of the machinery mixed with the distant echo of waves breaking on the island's cliffs. Operators returning from shifts walked along narrow paths illuminated only by dim lamps, their footsteps crunching on gravel. Sleep often came restlessly. The mind replayed radar echoes, imagined alarms, and the cadence of clipped voices. Yet every morning the cycle began again, because the station could never afford a pause. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of life at Ventnor was how ordinary it felt to the people living it. They rarely thought of themselves as heroes. They were technicians, operators, and clerks performing a job that had to be done. They did not see the broader battle picture, only the flickering lines before them. They did not hear Churchill's speeches or read strategic reports. They didn't watch squadrons climb and turn the sky. They simply delivered information, clear and precise, trusting that someone far above them would use it to guide the fight. In that sense, the the station's greatest strength came from its people. The technology, for all its innovation, depended entirely on the vigilance and discipline of those who monitored it. Their dedication turned cold radio waves into actionable intelligence. Their steadiness transformed uncertainty into warning. And their quiet resilience, on a windswept hill, inside wooden huts that shook with every winter storm, formed the human foundation of Britain's early warning shield. From this human perspective, the story widens into the broader tactical and technological angles that define the importance of Ventnor and the chain home system. While the human story of Ventnor revealed the emotional weight carried by its operators, the strategic and technological story showed just how delicately the entire system balanced on their work. Chain home was a triumph of early radar engineering, yet it was far from a flawless shield. The system excelled at detecting high and medium altitude formations at long distance, often over 100 miles away, but it struggled with low-flying aircraft. Anything flying close to the surface of the sea could disappear beneath the radar horizon, slipping through gaps undetectable until visual observers spotted them. This limitation forced Britain to integrate multiple layers of defense, radar, the Royal Observer Corps, sector stations, and fighter squadrons into one coordinated structure. Each piece compensated for the weaknesses of another. Technologically, chain home was almost brutal in its simplicity. The towers transmitted powerful pulses of radio energy, and the receivers listened for echoes. Operators had to distinguish between weather interference, sea reflections, and real aircraft returns. There were no screens with neat aircraft symbols, no automated tracking, no filtering algorithms. Everything depended on trained eyes and disciplined interpretation. Once a return was confirmed as hostile, it moved into the bloodstream of the Dowding System, feeding information to the filter room where strengths, altitudes, directions, and speeds were estimated. By the time the information reached RAF squadrons, it had passed through several layers of human judgment. The beauty of the system lay not in any single part, but in how skillfully those parts interlocked. Ventnor played a unique tactical role within this structure. Because of its position on the Isle of Wight, it served as the southernmost outpost of Britain's radar chain. Its range extended toward the Cotentin Peninsula, capturing echoes from formations rising out of northern France. When German bombers assembled near Cherbourg or Cannes, Ventnor often detected them earlier than mainland stations. This early glimpse, sometimes just a few minutes sooner, gave the RAF time to coordinate squadrons at Tangmere, Middle Wallop, Exeter, and other critical bases. Even a brief warning could be the difference between intercepting bombers at altitude or watching them break through toward Portsmouth, Southampton, or the vital naval facilities of the Solent. German intelligence, however, struggled to grasp the importance of these radar stations. Reconnaissance photos showed tall towers and fence compounds, and Luftwaffe analysts correctly identified them as radio installations. But they underestimated their resilience and misunderstood their role. Early in the Battle of Britain, Luftwaffe raid planners considered targeting the chain home network, especially stations like Ventnor, whose position made them tempting objects of attack. Several early morning strikes were launched against radar masts along the coast. Yet the Germans failed to destroy the system. Chain home's transmitters and receivers were separated across different parts of each station. The towers were rugged structures that could survive near misses. And even when equipment was damaged, repairs could often be completed within hours. This miscalculation became one of the Luftwaffe's most significant strategic errors. After initial attacks, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring concluded that radar stations were too difficult to knock out and not worth the effort. He believed that destroying RAF airfields and aircraft on the ground would have a greater impact. As a result, the early warning chain, Ventnor included, was left largely intact during the critical early phase of the battle. While German bombers shifted their focus to sector airfields and aircraft factories, Britain retained the ability to track incoming raids with astonishing accuracy. This allowed Fighter Command to concentrate its limited aircraft where they were needed most. Göring's decision to abandon systematic attacks on radar sites granted Britain a lifeline it might not have survived without. The irony was striking. Germany possessed overwhelming numbers, advanced aircraft, and tactical momentum, but it fought the Battle of Britain at a disadvantage because it fought blind. The Luftwaffe had to locate RAF fighters the hard way by flying into the sky and hoping to draw them out. British squadrons, meanwhile, rose with purpose. They climbed into the right patch of sky, at the right altitude, at the right moment. The radar operators might not have known the fate their signals shaped, but German pilots felt it keenly. Many reported that British fighters seemed to appear out of nowhere, perfectly positioned for interception. The truth was more mundane and far more devastating. They had been seen long before they crossed the coast. Vintner's role in this dynamic was both simple and profound. It did not fire a shot, launch an aircraft, or command a battle. It simply watched, patiently, continuously, through rain and sun and fog, and sent its warnings out across cables and telephone lines. The station's value lay in the seconds it provided, the small slices of time that allowed the RAF to transform scattered, outnumbered squadrons into a coordinated defensive force. Those moments, often unnoticed and uncelebrated, altered the shape of the battle and ultimately the course of the war. And it was precisely because of this importance that Vintner became a target, setting the stage for the dramatic turning point when a Luftwaffe struck directly at the heart of Britain's early warning shield. The final days before the Luftwaffe's great assault brought a heavy tension to stations like Vintner. Operators worked their shifts with growing awareness that the enemy was probing the coast more aggressively. Reconnaissance flights grew bolder. German bombers were gathering in greater numbers across the channel. And in the early hours of Monday, August 12, 1940, the long-expected blow finally fell. It marked the opening strike of what would become known as the hardest day, and it was aimed squarely at Britain's defensive eyes. Shortly after dawn, radar operators at several chain home stations detected unusual movement over the French coast, fast, scattered blips rising from airfields near Cherbourg and the Pas-de-Calais. These echoes were the first wave of Junkers 88s and Me-110 fighter bombers, dispatched with a clear mission: cripple the southern radar net. As the formations gained altitude and crossed the channel, their signatures thickened on the scopes. The reports reached fighter command, and squadrons were scrambled where possible, but the timing was brutally tight. The Luftwaffe was coming in low and fast, aiming to strike before Britain could fully react. For Vintner, the attack arrived with shocking precision. The station's elevated position made it a natural target, its towers standing stark against the morning sky. Witnesses recalled the sudden roar of engines as the bombers approached, skimming over the cliffs before climbing sharply to release their payloads. In the huts, operators felt the first concussions as explosions ripped across the hillside. Bombs walked their way up the slope, tearing craters into chalk and earth. Windows shattered inward. Dust and debris filled the rooms. The once steady hum of equipment dissolved into the crackle of damaged circuits, cut cables, and flickering screens. Outside, the tall steel transmitter towers shuddered under the blasts. Though robust, they were not invulnerable. Near misses severed power lines and toppled smaller ancillary structures. One hut took a direct hit, its roof blown apart in a spray of timbers and splintered paneling. The receiver site, offset from the main towers, was struck as well, damaging vital components that fed signals into the Bawdsey system. In a matter of minutes, Vintner, the southernmost node of Britain's radar chain, fell silent. To higher command, its absence appeared as a hole on the coastal map, a sudden darkness in the electronic curtain stretching across the channel. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Communications from the hilltop were intermittent, and several operators had to be evacuated from damaged huts. Mechanics rushed toward the impacted sites, navigating smoke, debris, and unexploded ordnance. Inside the remaining operational sections of the station, personnel struggled to determine the extent of the damage. Radios crackled with uncertain reports. The filter room noted the disappearance of Vintner's plots and had to rely more heavily on mainland stations to cover the gap. In a battle where seconds mattered, The loss of even one station threatened to shift the balance. Fighter Command moved quickly to improvise. Temporary coverage was attempted using adjacent stations, such as Poling and Dover, though their ranges did not fully reach Ventnor sector. Mobile radar units, smaller, truck-mounted systems deployed for emergencies, were ordered toward the Isle of Wight. Their equipment was nowhere near as powerful as Chain-Holmes tall transmitters, but anything that restored partial situational awareness was better than leaving the southern coast blind. Ground crews and engineers worked under constant threat of follow-up attacks, clearing debris and attempting to restart systems that had been battered into silence. From a German perspective, the attack seemed successful. Aerial reconnaissance captured images of damaged towers, wrecked huts, and smoking earth. Reports sent back to Luftwaffe Command suggested that several stations, including Ventnor, had been knocked out entirely. To the Germans, who still misunderstood the distributed nature of Chain-Holmes equipment, this appeared to confirm their belief that Britain's radar network was fragile, a network of tall, conspicuous structures that could be destroyed with focused effort. Some German commanders argued for continued strikes on the radar sites to finish the job. Yet, Göring, convinced that the British warning system was not the decisive factor, soon diverted his bombers toward airfields instead. On the ground at Ventnor, however, the damage was as real as it was dangerous. For the first time in the battle, a major section of the radar chain was offline. Britain's invisible shield had been pierced, leaving a vulnerable gap through which raids could slip if timed correctly. The operators, shaken but determined, worked alongside engineers and mobile units to re-establish even the faintest signal. Their task was urgent, because more raids were already forming across the Channel, and the skies over southern England were about to enter one of the most critical phases of the entire conflict. Ventnor's silence could not last. Too much depended on the station's ability to see into the Channel once more. And as the next hours unfolded, Britain's survival would hinge on whether the system could be restored quickly enough to resist a Luftwaffe convinced that the air defense network was crumbling beneath its assault. The hours following the attack on Ventnor unfolded with a tension that rippled across every level of Britain's defensive system. Radar stations, sector controllers, and fighter squadrons understood that the loss of any outpost threatened to tilt the balance, but the damage to the southernmost station carried special weight. Ventnor had been the first to see far into the Channel, the first link in the chain that warned of raids forming over northern France. Its momentary silence created uncertainty, and uncertainty was exactly what the Luftwaffe hoped to exploit as they prepared their next major onslaught. On August 13, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched Adler Tag, Eagle Day, a coordinated assault designed to cripple Fighter Command once and for all. Hundreds of bombers and fighters assembled across French airfields. Their movement was chaotic on radar screens, a mass of shifting formations that spread like a cloud across the Channel. Even with Ventnor offline, Britain's remaining stations detected enough early traces to alert the filter room. In London, plotters raced to update the massive map as new reports flooded in, each one representing another incoming formation. The pressure on the Dowding System intensified, but the chain held, even with one of its vital southern posts still being repaired. Meanwhile, on St. Boniface Down, the fight to restore Ventnor's capability continued with relentless determination. Engineers worked amid debris, reconnecting damaged cables, replacing shattered components, and coaxing life back into equipment that had been shaken apart by bombs. Mobile radar units parked on nearby ground provided temporary coverage, their smaller antennas sweeping the sea in an effort to compensate for the station's damaged arrays. Slowly, faint returns began to appear. The signals were weaker, less reliable, but they were something, and something mattered. Every flicker of information gave Fighter Command a few more moments to position their limited squadrons. As Adler Tag unfolded, the Luftwaffe discovered that Britain was not as blind as they had hoped. Fighter squadrons rose to meet them in a series of fierce engagements across the southern counties. Hurricanes and Spitfires intercepted bombers heading for Portsmouth, Southampton, and RAF airfields further inland. Many of these fighters had been directed based on incomplete but still vital information from the repaired and neighboring radar stations. For the German crews, it felt as if the RAF appeared at precisely the wrong moments, climbing out of cloud banks, diving from the sun, or waiting at altitude before the bombers even began their approach. They had expected scattered resistance. Instead, they encountered calculated interceptions. In the days that followed, the Luftwaffe pushed even harder. Vintner's partial restoration became critical as fresh waves of bombers crossed the channel. When fully coherent radar plots flowed again, Britain's defensive rhythm returned. Controllers knew which formations were feints, which were real, and where to send their pilots. German squadrons found themselves flying into engagements they could neither predict nor avoid. Their navigators complained of uncanny British timing. Some Luftwaffe commanders began to suspect that the radar network was far more robust than they had been led to believe. Others blamed faulty intelligence. Yet the truth was painfully simple. The system worked. Vintner's early warning role, even when reduced or partially impaired, continued to give Britain just enough time to muster resistance in the right places. The impact on Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was profound. The German High Command had always insisted that an invasion could not proceed without air superiority. Yet despite their overwhelming numbers, the Luftwaffe failed to break Fighter Command's operational backbone. Radar, including the one silent station at Vintner, denied them the element of surprise. British fighters remained a constant threat. Each failed raid, each lost bomber, each unexpected interception chipped away at the confidence of German planners. The channel, always unpredictable, became too dangerous to cross with slow, vulnerable barges carrying tens of thousands of soldiers. By late August, German losses were mounting faster than replacements could be trained. Luftwaffe morale faltered. Pilots began expressing frustration that the RAF seemed impossible to pin down, impossible to catch unprepared. The British, they said, must be receiving information from some hidden source, unaware that the source was not hidden at all, but standing in plain sight on the Isle of Wight, battered yet still functioning. Vintner had resumed enough of its watch to contribute to the defensive network during some of the most decisive days of the campaign. Ultimately, the Luftwaffe failed to achieve the dominance required for Sea Lion to proceed. Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. German barges and landing craft remained tied to their docks. Troops who had boarded transport vessels, expecting to cross the channel, were quietly reassigned. Britain, still reeling from losses, remained bruised but unbroken. And though pilots, anti-aircraft gunners, and commanders earned much of the public glory, the radar stations, including the tiny, battered outpost on St. Boniface Down, had played a role just as critical. By providing precious minutes of warning in a battle measured by seconds, they helped prevent an invasion that could have changed the course of history. The fight, of course, did not end with the failure of Sea Lion. Germany shifted its strategy again, turning from military targets towards cities. But the outcome of those crucial weeks in the summer of 1940 meant that Britain would continue the war as a free nation. And Vintner's story now moved from the heat of battle into the long, grinding aftermath that shaped the rest of the conflict. By late October 1940, the Battle of Britain had drawn to a close. The Luftwaffe's attacks had grown less frequent, less organized, and increasingly desperate. German losses in pilots and aircraft were mounting beyond what training schools could replace. Britain, too, had paid a heavy price, airfields scarred by bomb craters, squadrons reduced to a fraction of their former strength, and pilots exhausted by ceaseless combat. Yet the RAF still stood. Fighter command remained intact, battered but far from broken. The newspapers celebrated the courage of the few, the pilots whose skill and endurance held the line. But behind those public stories lay a quieter reality. The battle had been decided as much on the ground as in the air. Within RAF headquarters, the leadership understood the significance of the radar chain. Reports circulated acknowledging that the integration of chain home into the Dowding system had been the decisive factor that allowed Britain to counter a numerically superior enemy. Without early detection, squadrons would have burned fuel in endless patrols, aircraft would have been caught on the ground, and the RAF's limited resources would have been overwhelmed. Instead, radar granted time, the most precious commodity of all. It allowed British fighters to be directed with precision, concentrating strength exactly where it was needed. It prevented the Luftwaffe from ever achieving the surprise necessary to shatter Britain's defenses. Vintner's role in this achievement became a point of quiet pride within the service, even if the public knew nothing about it. After the August bombing, the station had been repaired under extreme pressure. Engineers and mechanics worked tirelessly through dust-filled rooms and damaged equipment, restoring functionality one component at a time. By September, Vintner was operating reliably once more, feeding information into the National Defense Network as raids shifted toward London and Britain's industrial centers. Its resilience demonstrated something essential. Chain Home was not a fragile collection of experimental towers. It was a living, adaptable system, capable of absorbing damage and continuing its mission. The men and women who served at Vintner returned to their routines as best they could. The wooden huts were patched, equipment replaced, and new procedures introduced to improve resilience against future attacks. Operators resumed their shifts, staring once more into the green arcs of their screens, listening to the steady pulse of transmissions. Night after night, they watched for the faint signs of incoming raids that now often headed for cities rather than airfields. Though the fear of invasion had receded, the war continued with relentless intensity. London burned during the Blitz, ports were hammered, and civilians across the island faced the grim reality of total war. Vintner's task remained unchanged: to see trouble coming before it reached British shores. There was little public recognition for this work. The precise nature of radar remained a closely guarded secret. Civilians living in towns below the Down saw the tall towers and fenced-off buildings, but had no real understanding of what happened inside. Even some RAF personnel outside Fighter Command knew only that the stations played an important but mysterious role. The operators at Vintner received no medals, no public ceremonies, no newspaper headlines. Their contribution was hidden behind classifications and silence. Only after the war would their role begin to be acknowledged. Still, those who served at the station carried their own sense of accomplishment. They knew, perhaps better than anyone, how close the country had come to disaster. They knew how vulnerable the chain had been, how vital every correctly interpreted return proved during the fiercest days of the battle. They also understood that the system's success had shaped events far beyond their hilltop. Because the radar chain held, because Fighter Command endured, Britain remained in the fight. That alone changed the trajectory of the entire war, enabling future campaigns in North Africa, the Atlantic, and eventually the liberation of Europe. As winter settled over the Isle of Wight, frost once again clung to the towers at dawn. The hum of machinery carried across the Down. Inside the huts, operators wrapped in greatcoats leaned into their screens, performing their duty with the same quiet intensity as before. The battle that had threatened Britain's very existence had ended in victory, but its cost lingered in memories, in scars, and in the knowledge that the war was far from over. And in time, the story of Vintner would shift yet again, transforming from a wartime outpost into a relic that would follow Britain into the next conflict, the Cold War. When the Second World War finally ended in 1945, stations like Vintner did not simply close their doors and fade from use. Radar had proven itself indispensable, and the geopolitical landscape shifted almost immediately into a new era of tension, one defined not by open invasion threats, but by long-range bombers, nuclear weapons, and the emerging rivalry between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. In this new world, early warning remained essential. And so, while the rest of the country celebrated peace, Vintner quietly transitioned into yet another chapter of silent vigilance. Chain Home itself became obsolete as new radar technologies emerged. The wooden huts, The towering transmitter masts and the primitive cathode-ray screens were no longer adequate to track the faster, higher-flying aircraft of the post-war world. But the site, perched high above the channel, with unobstructed views in every direction, retained immense strategic value. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Air Ministry repurposed Ventnor to support a new generation of radar systems designed for the Cold War. Concrete bunkers replaced the fragile wartime huts. Hardened structures were built into the hillside, able to withstand potential blast waves. Thick steel doors sealed operations rooms where new equipment monitored air traffic and, later, missile trajectories. What had once been an experimental wartime station evolved into part of a broader British radar network that linked into NATO's early warning system. The tension of the period, marked by events like the Berlin blockade, the Korean War, and the advent of Soviet long-range bombers, ensured that Ventnor remained active. The site expanded, sprouting new antenna arrays, communications equipment, and above-ground structures identifiable only to those who knew what they were looking at. In official documents, Ventnor's post-war role was often described vaguely, sometimes merely as an air defense radar station, preserving the secrecy that had surrounded the location since the 1930s. For the local population, the hill remained an odd presence. Islanders grew used to the clusters of buildings and the fenced, restricted compound atop St. Boniface Down. Rumors circulated about its purpose. Some believed it tracked ships, others thought it monitored foreign radio signals. Very few understood that Ventnor had once been a cornerstone in the battle that kept Britain free. Even fewer realized that it had now become part of a global defensive network designed to detect the earliest signs of a potential nuclear strike. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, technology outpaced even these upgraded systems. New radar stations, satellite tracking, and early warning installations replaced the old post-war complexes. Gradually, Ventnor's role diminished. Equipment was removed. Buildings were decommissioned. The site transitioned into a shadowed afterlife, its significance remembered by few, overlooked by many. The great steel towers of the wartime era had already come down years earlier, dismantled when they were no longer needed. Only shells of concrete structures, empty corridors, and rusting foundations remained, scattered across the high ground like forgotten monuments to a different age. As nature reclaimed the Down, walkers and hikers passed the old bunkers without knowing what history had unfolded there. Sheep grazed where radar operators had once worked through nights of fear and urgency. The wind that had once battered wooden huts now brushed against silent concrete ruins. Occasionally, veterans returned to the ridge. Some revisited the places where they had spent their youth staring into glowing screens. Others walked the paths they had once patrolled with rifles. They seldom found the exact rooms they remembered. Time and redevelopment had reshaped the site, but the view remained the same. The channel stretched out below, calm and empty, giving no trace of the formation routes where enemy bombers had once gathered. Efforts eventually emerged to preserve parts of the site. Local historians recognized Ventnor's significance and pushed to protect surviving structures. Some remnants were granted listed status, acknowledged as part of Britain's wartime heritage. Exhibits and museums on the Isle of Wight began to include references to the radar station, its role in the Battle of Britain, and its importance during the early Cold War. Slowly, the story resurfaced, not in grand monuments or national ceremonies, but in quiet acknowledgments that this lonely hilltop had shaped events far beyond its size. Today, the remnants of Ventnor sit quietly among grasses and windswept paths. The roar of bombers is gone, replaced by the distant call of seabirds and the steady sigh of the channel below. The hill no longer watches for raids or tracks foreign aircraft. Yet for those who know its story, every fragment of concrete and every weathered foundation serves as a reminder of what once stood there and what was saved because it did. From this vantage point, with peace settled over a place once braced for war, the story of Ventnor turns naturally toward reflection, what this small station meant, and what its legacy continues to mean for the history of Britain and the evolution of warfare. History often remembers the loudest moments, the roar of engines, the clash of armies, the speeches delivered in times of crisis. Yet the outcome of the Battle of Britain turned not on spectacle, but on the quiet endurance of a system that worked in shadows. Vintner, with its wooden huts, humming screens, and wind-battered towers, embodied a truth that would come to define modern warfare. The most decisive weapons are often the ones no one sees. From its hilltop perch, the station looked humble, almost fragile, yet it played a role that far exceeded its appearance. Vintner did not shoot down enemy aircraft, nor did it send formations into battle. Instead, it provided something more valuable: time. Seconds of warning, minutes of preparation, the invisible advantage that allowed Britain's small fighter force to stand against overwhelming odds. Without such early warning posts, the Luftwaffe might have found the RAF blind and unprepared. With them, the pattern of the battle changed entirely. Vintner became a quiet sentinel that shaped the timing and tactics of an entire campaign. The story of Vintner also reveals something about the people who serve in war. Most were young, many untrained before the conflict began, yet their ability to stay focused, steady, and precise under immense pressure made the difference between scattered chaos and coordinated defense. They worked in obscurity, far from the headlines, knowing their mistakes could cost lives, but receiving little recognition when they succeeded. Their contribution stands as a reminder that courage can be quiet, measured not in dramatic heroics, but in unwavering commitment to a task that few will ever fully understand. Today, the hill is peaceful. The masts are gone, the machinery silent. Walkers cross the down, unaware that beneath their feet once ran cables linking Britain's first radar shield. But if one pauses and looks southward across the channel, it is possible to imagine the screens glowing again, the distant rumble of approaching aircraft, and the operators leaning forward as faint echoes appear on the edge of detection. It is possible to sense the weight carried by those who kept watch on this lonely height. Vintner's story endures because it shows how history can pivot on the unseen, how a tiny station, hidden from public view, helped prevent an invasion and preserve a nation. In the quiet of that realization lies the true legacy of the hilltop that once saved Britain.